And good afternoon. You're listening to Ken Hudnall. This is the Ken Hudnall Show. Coming to you from our studios right here in exciting El Paso, Texas. Gateway to the Old West and the most haunted city in the country. Somebody asked me about that, and I pointed out that I had done ghost tours in this town for 20 years. It is definitely the most haunted city in the country. Well, today is the 269th day of the year. It's September 26th. 96 days remain to the year's over with. Holidays and observances. It's National Alpaca Day, German Butterbrat Day. It's a simple piece of toast and your favorite high-quality butter. Native American Day. Learn about the rich cultures of Native American tribes in your area. Save the Koala Day. It's also Hug a Vegetarian Day. Human Resource Professional Day. National Doodle Day. Support funding and research into epilepsy by doodling and submitting your works of art with a donation to this important cause. National Dumpling Day. European Day of Languages. The diverse European languages weave a tapestry of communication, unites cultures through rich linguistic mosaic. National Chimichanga Day. National Johnny Appleseed Day. I always thought he was a fictional character, but there was an individual who became known as Johnny Appleseed, who was quite active. National Day of Praise and Worship, Better Breakfast Day, and Lumberjack Day. Dress up as a lumberjack, eat a hearty meal, honor this venerable, crucial, and often dangerous profession of lumberjacking. Definitely acting up today. National Law Enforcement Suicide Awareness Day. Shamu the Whale Day. National Brave Day. Love Note Day. National Key Lime Pie Day. National Mesothelioma Awareness Day. Stanislav Petrov Day. Honor and celebrate this former Soviet military officer known for his critical role in preventing a nuclear war during the Cold War. Macmillan Coffee Morning. Sport purple for Platelets Day. National Situational Awareness Day. World Contraception Day. AFL Grand Final Friday. International Week of Deaf People. Seed Gathering Season. Elvis Festival Porthcrawl. Red Valley. National Sea Otter Awareness Week. National Eye Health Week. And, of course, it's Milan Fashion Week. Goes on through the 29th. Hispanic Heritage Month. Oktoberfest. Deaf Dog Awareness Week. Famous people born in the state. Linda Hamilton and T.S. Eliot. Well, with all that having been said, let's see what interesting stories we have in the news. Because there's a number of fascinating things going on right now. Maybe. We also, I noticed in this morning's news that James Comey has been indicted, former head of the FBI. He's going to have to answer for his involvement in the Russiagate hoax, where everybody and their brother did their best to convince the world that President Trump was a Russian agent. Well, former FBI Director James Comey, as I said, has been indicted by a grand jury not on one but on 2 counts. And it's caused a fierce political reaction on both sides. He faces charges as President Trump warns that the Russia hoax actually brought on a threat of nuclear war. He says Comey placed a cloud over the entire nation with Crossfire Hurricane. That's the operation that was put into effect to try to prove that President Trump was actually a Russian agent. Well, Tim Allen says Erica Kirk's memorial speech inspired him to forgive his father's killer. He's speaking out now. On Thursday, he took to X to share that he was personally moved by her forgiveness of the man that killed her husband, Charlie Kirk. Since forgiveness hadn't been easy for him to give. His father died in 1964 after a drunk driver's vehicle collided with his vehicle. Allen was 11 years old at the time of his father's death. And all that time he has not forgiven the man that killed his father. Well, J.D. Vance said he would love Jimmy Kimmel to apologize to Erica Kirk after his return from his recent suspension. Kimmel's show was pulled from the air after his comments on Charlie Kirk's death drew backlash from conservatives and Federal Communication Commission Chair Brendan Carr, who warned the agency would take regulatory action. According to Carr, Kimmel's trying to say he was just telling a joke. Well, he didn't tell a joke. He was actually accusing right-wing America, conservative America, of killing Charlie Kirk. We now know that's false. Kirk was murdered by a left-wing assassin who was radicalized by some of the rhetoric that we see coming from the far left. When you accuse the people who've been holding prayer vigils, who've been praying about Charlie Kirk, you accuse him of killing him. When you know as a left-wing assassin, you actually apologize for his murder. You're encouraging more of that violence to happen. And Kimmel, unfortunately, believes that he has the right to, in effect, yell fire in a movie theater. Well, city council member has resigned after going viral on libs of TikTok for viral comment made to Trump supporter. Bree Daniela Montoya, city councilwoman representing Norman, Oklahoma, Ward 3, resigned effective immediately Tuesday after a Facebook comment she wrote telling a Trump supporter to harm herself resurfaced and went viral when shared by libs of TikTok. The resignation followed months of inaction from the city council, according to critics, until the exchange gained national traction online. The city of Norman has since emphasized that while elected officials speak for themselves, it doesn't support actions of behaviors that may encourage harm. A lot of people, when they get elected, think they have the right to say or do whatever they want. Well, Waltz, Mike Waltz, the United Nations ambassador, called the mishaps that took place during President Trump's UN speech unacceptable, and he vowed to withhold U.S. funding until reforms are made. He appeared on Fox Business Kudlow. When host Larry Kudlow asked him about the incidents, it appeared as if the UN was trying to sabotage the president. Kudlow noted the escalator malfunctioned as Trump and First Lady Melania Trump arrived. The teleprompter failed and found that the auditorium sound cut off. Waltz added that the broadcast audio abruptly switched to Portuguese during Trump's speech before returning to English. He said this whole thing is unacceptable. It stinks. 150 world leaders there, and this only happened to him. Not once, not twice, but 3 times. Clearly, there was sabotage involved, is a feeling of a lot of people. North Carolina Democrat says there's no correlation between the Charlotte train attack and the accused of killer's repeated releases. The North Carolina state representative is under fire for saying there's no correlation between the murder of Irina Zaruchka, 23-year-old refugee from Ukraine, and the fact that her accused killer had been released from jail 14 times. State Representative Marcia Morey, a longtime Democratic lawmaker and former judge, made those comments while defending the state's bail system. Critics argue the system has allowed violent offenders to cycle in and out of custody with very little accountability. DeCarlos Brown has been described by authorities as a dangerous career criminal who's repeatedly in and out of jail before he allegedly stabs Zaruchka to death on the light rail train in Charlotte. Many people believe the broken bail system allowed him to remain free despite his violent record. And Morey, who's one of the North Carolina's most vocal advocates for bail reform, defended her comments and went on to condemn efforts to connect the case to bail policies. The mere fact that he was allowed to wander free after 14 arrests for violent crimes, she says, doesn't mean much. Well, the Seattle Seahawks interception turns into a fumble after the defender runs into his own teammate. There was an unfortunate miscue in the first quarter of their game against the Arizona Cardinals on Thursday night. Cardinals quarterback Kyler Murray dropped back to pass with about 8 minutes, 58 seconds left in the first quarter. Looking for a second-year wide receiver by the name of Marvin Harrison Jr. up the seam. But he misfired and threw the ball to Seahawks defensive back Kobe Bryant. Well, things like that happen in the heat of a moment. Well, an Oklahoma family's uncovered a really neat diamond at a state park, thanks to some dollar store tools. Oklahoma family members recently hit the jackpot when they found an impressive diamond at an Arkansas state park this month. The discovery made at Crater Diamond State Park in Murfreesboro, Arkansas, was announced by Arkansas State Parks September 23rd. The visitor, Renee Madison, and her family visited the natural state to celebrate the birthday of Madison's nephew, William. And while on that trip, they decided to stop by Crater Diamond State Park to try their luck at digging up diamonds. Well, they picked a spot to dig on the north side of the park's 37.5-acre diamond search area. They dug up a few buckets worth of dirt before they began sifting through their screens when Madison noticed an unusual oblong shiny stone. They had no idea what it was. They thought it was too big to be a diamond. Turns out it was a brown diamond weighing 2.79 carats, which is a pretty hefty find for that state park. Well, YouTube is facing some backlash over a planned Univision removal. Christopher Carr warns against abusing the position as Spanish language network faces $14.99 monthly tier shift. My radio show was originally on a Univision station until it was decided I wasn't liberal enough for them. Well, a brazen Blue State jewelry store heist was caught on camera as an armed mob makes off with $1 million in merchandise. Nearly 24 suspects, some of them armed, targeted a California jewelry store during a smash and grab robbery. Organized retail theft is continuing to be a major problem across that state. Surveillance video at Heller Jewelers in the Bay Area city of San Ramon captured a mob of masked thieves storming the store Monday, smashing displays with hammers and pickaxes, making off with $1 million in merchandise, according to the San Ramon Police Department. At least one suspect fired a shot through the front entrance. Others entered the store pointing firearms at employees. Once the heist was over, the suspects fled in waiting vehicles in the city center Bishop Ranch valet parking area. Police chased the cars but ended the pursuit to allow helicopters to track them. Several suspects were detained in Oakland and a nearby suburb, including 27-year-old Jimmy Ray and his brother Michael Ray. After an incident 2 weeks ago in San Jose, an 88-year-old jewelry store owner is recovering after she was shoved to the ground as thieves raided her stores in a similar smash and grab. Well, as long as they don't fear punishment, this is going to continue. Well, Georgetown students are upset about flyers that celebrate Charlie Kirk's murder that are appearing on campus. Students who spoke to Fox News said they were afraid and disappointed when they saw flyers posted on campus Wednesday by a far-left group that approvingly referenced the killer of Charlie Kirk. Jordan Van Slingerland, a senior international politics major, said first emotion was fear. What happened to Charlie Kirk hit not only Jordan, but a lot of other students on this campus very hard. And seeing the text that was on the bullet of the assassin who had taken his life was a bit scary. And now you've got notices being posted by far left groups trying to recruit. Well, China's rejected President Trump's nuclear talks and it showed off their new weapons at a parade. He wanted to discuss nuclear arms reduction. And shortly after that rejection, Beijing revealed new weapons in its World War II parade. That's a celebratory affair that Russia's Vladimir Putin and North Korea's Kim Jong-un also enjoyed. The parade showed a variety of cutting-edge technologies, but the nuclear delivery system stood out. Chinese military showcased a full triad of improved capabilities. Silo-launched intercontinental ballistic missiles, an air-launched ballistic missile, and a submarine-launched ballistic missile. Now, just 3 years ago, China denied it was building up its nuclear arsenal, but now we know that's definitely not true. All right. Well, Jesse Waters in his show made the comment that James Comey should have known his wrongdoing would catch up with him. When you misuse your position to try to take down your political enemies, you don't need that position. Well, Kamala Harris literally threw Joe Biden won talking points on the table after disastrous debate. When she was serving as vice president, she rejected Biden's campaign pressure to celebrate the then president as the winner of his disastrous debate against Donald Trump, saying she didn't want to be fed BS. That's according to her memoir that just came out called 107 Days. According to the Biden camp, he fought through his cold as he was fighting for the American people. That was a sheet of paper containing several talking points that was given to her. Biden's poor debate performance against Trump in June of 2024 served as the death knell to the campaign, who was already coping with mounting public concern about his mental acuity. And everybody was certain he wasn't going to be able to serve a second term. And despite the abject failure of a debate performance, his campaign wanted Harris to deliver favorable assessments of the debate to the American people. And she didn't and wouldn't. Well, archaeologists found an ancient harbor that's been swallowed up by the sea. It's right near Cleopatra's Temple. A 12-year-old girl on a family trip to that area found an ancient Egyptian amulet. Here we go. This hidden harbor was found in an ancient temple connected to Cleopatra VII. This was a very unexpected find for historians. Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities announced the discovery of the harbor September 18th. Found at the temple of Taposiris Magna, about 30 miles west of Alexandria. This temple was built in the Ptolemaic era, dedicated to Osiris, the Egyptian god of the afterlife. And though the temple from the 3rd century BC was constructed 2 centuries before Cleopatra ruled, it was still in use by the time she took power. And Cleopatra, who's still respected in Egypt but vilified in Roman accounts, promoted the cult of Isis and Osiris, and artifacts from her rule have been found at that site. Well, Gavin Newsom is making every effort to stay in the news. He now says GM's Mary Barra sold us out on electric vehicle policies and federal subsidies. He says GM's Mary Barra and American auto manufacturers enabled foreign policy changes. He's put the blame squarely on General Motors and the CEO for the rollback of electric vehicle subsidies and other anti-EV measures advanced by Trump administration, Republicans in Congress. He was asked last week about the state of California's capacity to replace the federal EV subsidies that were ended by the Trump administration, and said, "You're talking about the Biden-era tax credit that the Trump administration eliminated. We can't make up for federal vandalism with those tax credits, but we can't continue to make the unprecedented investments in infrastructure which we're doing." He's perfectly happy to spend your tax money on his policies. Well, a professor is fighting dismissal for calling Charlie Kirk a Nazi. He's just been given a legal win, fueling a free speech debate. After several school districts and universities across the nation fired suspended faculty for their controversial social media post about the murder of Charlie Kirk, some of these educators are now taking legal action, claiming their free speech rights were violated. On Wednesday, one of God's anointed ordered the University of South Dakota to temporarily reinstate Professor Michael Hook after the Board of Regents recommended his termination over a social media post that discussed Kirk's killing. He's a tenured fine arts professor. He wrote in his personal Facebook account he didn't give a flying F about Kirk, calling him a hate-spreading Nazi. Well, 3 hours later, he deleted the post, but according to his lawsuit, the Board of Regents moved swiftly to fire him after prominent state officials called for his removal. And his complaint alleges the university retaliated against him for exercising his First Amendment rights by commenting in his private capacity on a matter of national discourse. Matthew Cargill, a longtime art teacher at Oskaloosa High School in Iowa, brought a similar case after he was fired after posting a "One Nazi Down" on his personal Facebook page. There's still questions that have been brought up about the Kirk assassination. Supposedly, one doctor made the comment the bullet taken out of his body didn't match the caliber of the gun that was found. And in another case, there were witnesses who said the shot came from behind him, not from in front of him. So that's still going to have to be worked out before Tyler Robinson faces justice, so to speak. Well, an individual who says they're a gender transitioner said the doctors abused their power over her. It's becoming quite an interesting argument. A lot of people say that they were pressured into making the transition to the opposite sex. Well, let's see what news stories we have. Well, excuse me for coughing into the microphone. That snuck up on me. Well, yesterday we did a show about UFOs. And there's no discussion of UFOs complete until you talk about the ghost rockets seen over Sweden in 1946. On July 19th, 1946, a Swedish farmer by the name of Knut Lindback was chopping woods near a small farm by the shore of Lake Komjarv. For him, that lake had always been essential to his way of life. He drank from it, he fished in it, used it as a route for daily travel. His family raised their own meat and grew their own vegetables, living almost entirely off the land. And that day, his maid, Peter Pearson, was nearby, ready to help with the daily chores. This was the first full year after the war ended, people trying to return to a sense of normalcy. And although World War II had ended, the Swedes remained wary of any loud noises in the sky. Of course, in 1946, tensions were high as the Soviet Union appeared determined to expand its influence across Europe. And Sweden, being less than 300 miles from the Russian border, was certainly on edge. The fear of airstrikes, though actually unlikely, still loomed, and most Swedes kept a vigilant eye on the sky. And at 11:45 a.m., Lindback and Pearson heard a humming sound overhead. At first it was low and distant, but it grew into a tremendous and unfamiliar noise. Then Beck looked up and first thought it was a thunderstorm, then the sky was clear and no storm clouds. And then he saw it, a gray, elongated, rocket-like object descending rapidly from above. He said it was about 2 meters long, had a snub nose, a pointed tail, and possibly small wing-like protrusions on its sides. And although Sweden still remembered the war and the terrifying V-bombs the Nazis had launched, which typically targeted major cities, the Beck's isolated farm seemed to look like a target for a V-bomb. How could something like this be crashing here in the middle of nowhere? Well, before you could make any sense out of it, the object plunged into the lake, generated a massive splash and a cascade of water. Force that had impacts that ripples across the lake, and part of the lake bed was actually thrown up on the shore. Well, the crash site was about a mile from where Lindbeck and Pearson stood, near the southwestern shore. At first, he thought it might be a V-1 bomb, an early form of cruise missile used during World War II, known for its distinct rocket pod. But a V-1 would have traveled in a straight line, not dived vertically. And this object had a stubby nose, unlike the pointed noses typical of the V-1. Well, based on this description, the possibility of it being a German wartime rocket was ruled out. Well, he decided to row out to the point of impact, and he was certainly startled by the incident, but also driven by curiosity. He wanted to know what had crashed into his lake, especially after such a massive collision. He expected to find the waters littered with debris from whatever the object was. When he got to the crash site, he discovered uprooted seaweed and water lilies thrown ashore, along with a muddy, disturbed water. But there were no debris. During World War II, when V-bombs crashed in Sweden, they typically left behind 4,400 to 6,600 pounds of wreckage. But in this case, there was nothing, not even a scrap of metal. Well, the lake was only about 2 meters deep, so he checked the lake bed to see if the object might have be stuck in the silt. Probed the bottom with an oar, hoping to find something solid beneath the surface. Didn't find any trace of the wreckage. Another witness, a 14-year-old Friedborg Tigerbull, also reported hearing a loud noise and seeing a large splash in the lake. She'd been on the northern shore at the time, described the sound as similar to a thunderclap, and her dog reacted with visible fear to the event. The mystery extended beyond the lake. The crash on July 19th was one of 4 reported crashes within a 5-hour span. And strangely enough, all 4 of them occurred in remote lakes. It was odd, considering that Sweden has a vast expanse of land. Statistically, one of the objects should have crashed on solid ground, but none did. The pattern baffled both authorities and civilians. The incident defied any conventional explanation. That evening, local police and Home Guard personnel cordoned off the area. The next day, Lieutenant Carl Gustav Bartol of the Swedish Army Engineer Corps arrived with a team to conduct an official investigation. Over the course of 3 weeks, the military carried out an extensive search, examining roughly 21,000 square feet of the lake bed every day. They used electrical probes and mining equipment and metal detectors and Geiger counters and collected more than 35,000 samples. After that exhaustive effort, all collected materials were identified as naturally occurring in the area. Nothing foreign was found. No wreckage, no debris. Bartol later reported the lake bed showed signs of disturbance, but speculated the object may have disintegrated upon impact, possibly having been made from a lightweight material like magnesium alloy. Well, this incident was part of a broader wave of unexplained aerial sightings over Sweden in 1946. That summer, as many as 30 similar crashes were recorded across the country. In each case, no wreckage was ever recovered. In response, the Swedish military classified these unidentified aerial objects as ghost rockets and established a special ghost rocket committee to study them further. And while some sightings ultimately attributed to meteors, the committee admitted that others, like this first one, couldn't be explained by natural phenomena or any known aircraft. Radar and other instruments had detected anomalies, but none that clarified the origin or nature of these mysterious intrusions. Well, from the ghost rockets in Sweden, let's go to France. The year's 1952. We have angel hair. It's October 17th, to be exact, just outside the town of Oloron in southwestern France. Locals are confronted by a most unusual sight. Something was inching its way toward the town, passing the residences and heading straight for the local college. Jean-Yves Prigent was the head of a college in the city of Oloron, a small city in the Basque region. Unaware of what was happening in the sky, he was on his way home for lunch. His family lived in a house located on the school grounds. Now, the Prigent family was well regarded in the community, and his wife was also a teacher, and they had 3 children. At lunchtime, he called his son Jean to come to the table, and Jean didn't move. Instead, he stood by the window and said, "Come see this. It's fantastic." Well, he joined his son and saw a strange cylindrical-shaped object at the edge of the campus. It was certainly out of place, highly unusual, and clearly not an aircraft. After a few moments, the cylinder began moving again, coming directly toward him. The object slowly positioned itself directly above the school campus at a 45-degree incline. Nobody had any idea what it was. Well, he called his wife to the window, and she joined him along with their other 2 children. They saw the cylinder was surrounded by several smaller objects, which soon merged with the larger cylinder. These small objects resembled tiny clouds, and despite having a clear view from the window, he wanted to see more details, so he got his binoculars. That's when he realized the objects were not small, fluffy clouds. Instead, he saw a red spear encircled by a yellow disc. Seconds later, the large object appeared to expel something into the atmosphere. At that point, his son yelled out, "It's falling," and something that looked like white smoke was coming out of the object. Of course, this smoke didn't behave like normal smoke. It didn't rise into the air. Instead, it slowly drifted downward toward the ground. Curious, the family rushed out to the yard to see what was going on. Well, that substance expelled from the cylinder fell to the ground and over the tree branches. They picked it up and handled it and tried to figure out what it was. And Prigent wasn't the only one who noticed. He and his family saw other members of the school community had already gathered and were also attempting to investigate and identify this mysterious material. The objects emitting that glowing substance hovered overhead. The material falling to the ground was both solid and wispy. It came down in long strands. Some people described the strands as resembling nylon fibers, and others compared them to spider webs, very white and very delicate. Well, since this event took place in a community of teachers, many began to examine the material with a spirit of scientific curiosity. They picked it up and tried to manipulate it, eager to determine what it was. Rather than being frightened, they were actually intrigued. One of the teachers even conducted simple experiments on the material and tried to burn it. And it burned like cellophane or cotton, but unlike natural cotton, it ignited quickly and easily. UFO experts later gave this strange material a name. It became known as angel hair. And the leading theory suggests that angel hair formed when ionized air seeped from the electromagnetic field surrounding an unidentified craft. But of course, there were other explanations. The leading theory about angel hair suggested it was spider webs or spider silk, that the UFOs observed in the sky were actually giant clumps of spiders migrating in the fall. And as they traveled, they spun strands of silk that eventually fell to the ground. Some people attempted to collect samples to take to a lab, but the strange thing was the material dissipated on its own over time. This phenomenon had been reported in many angel hair cases. Whatever did produce this mysterious substance never seemed to last long. The large object and the smaller ones gradually left the scene, disappearing into the distance. These bizarre craft are last seen heading eastward toward Toulouse. And with their disappearance, the angel hair also vanished. All of it dissipated. The Prigent family and the school community were left with an unsolved and perplexing mystery. Many people refuted the theory of airborne spiders, arguing that spider webs didn't evaporate the way this stringy material in Oloron had been observed to disappear. Well, 5 days later, this mystery repeated itself in the nearby town of Tarbes. where similar flying objects left behind an identical trail of strange material. An almost identical series of events occurred in Gaillac, France, 10 days later. Well, when the ancient hair is finally analyzed in a lab, it's found to contain silicon, calcium, magnesium, and boron, all minerals commonly found in the Earth's crust. However, why these elements would suddenly appear and bind together into fibers was never determined. Well, our next story comes from Madagascar. Tenerife. There was a mass sighting in 1954. It was August 16th, 1954. In Tenerife, Madagascar, most citizens lived in the bustling capital city. Among them was an airline executive by the name of Edmond Campagnac, former pilot from France who'd relocated thousands of kilometers from home. He served as the chief technical officer for the Madagascar division of Air France. And he was a well-respected, intelligent, and highly trained technical expert, and he was a former artillery officer. Well, he and his colleagues had been waiting for an overdue mail plane. That was their primary connection to the outside world. At this point in time, Madagascar was still a French colony with regular services from France delivering mail daily. And although Tenerife wasn't Paris, it was far from a rural backwater. It was a lively city with a large population and active social scene. That evening, he and his colleagues passed through the city's main market on the way to the outdoor cafe. It was dusk, about 6 p.m. The sky was clear. The streets were clouded with people, and the group chose a table to offer an unobstructed view of the sky. As they relaxed, they chatted about the mail they'd received and shared news from family and friends. And suddenly he looked up and saw something strange in the sky. It appeared to be a greenish object descending from the sky at an angle. One of them speculated it was the mail plane coming back. Another said it was no airplane he'd ever seen. Well, originally they thought it was a meteorite ready to crash. They watched it descend as it came down closer and closer. In 1954, there were no satellites that could have been falling from the sky, so a meteorite seemed like the most logical explanation. And it wasn't just he and his colleagues that saw it. Hundreds, maybe even thousands of witnesses saw the phenomena. And of course, fear quickly spread. A major meteor crashing into the island of Madagascar, especially into its capital city, would result in a catastrophic loss of life. As the object moved over their heads and across the sky, something extraordinary happened. The lights began to flicker. Then the mysterious object streaked directly over the open-air market and disappeared behind a rooftop. Everybody braced themselves, waiting for the explosion they knew was going to come. But they never heard any sound of impact. To their astonishment, this object reappeared in the sky, hovering right above them, moved closer, this time unmistakably visible. What they were seeing was no meteorite. It was an incredibly unusual-looking craft. Well, of course, as was to be expected, panic gripped the crowd. They had no idea what it was going to do. Was it going to harm them? Fear and uncertainty filled the air. People on the streets became freaked out. Most of the market visitors fled, but a few, including the Campagnac and his colleagues, remained to watch. The object wasn't moving very fast. It hovered just a few hundred meters above their heads, giving them plenty of time to observe it. And whatever it was, it had a lozenge-shaped or disc-like structure, roughly the size of a small aircraft. And behind it trailed a stream of red-orange sparks, resembling the exhaust of a jet engine or some form of chemical combustion. But amazingly enough, it didn't make any sound. Well, they were all captivated. They tried to identify it using their knowledge of aircraft, but there's only one answer they could come up with. It was like nothing any of them had ever seen before. And suddenly all the lights in the city went out. The entire city of Tenerife plunged into a complete blackout that lasted for 10 minutes. Well, it appeared to the watchers that whatever this was cut the power. It seemed as though the aircraft had created a field that disrupted the electrical grid below. And in the mid-1950s, there was no country on this planet, not even the U.S. or the Soviet Union, had the technology to achieve such an effect. And just as suddenly as the lights went out, they flickered back on. When everybody looked back into the sky, that mysterious craft had vanished. Incredibly, within 2 or 3 minutes of its disappearance, an identical, or maybe the same object was reported 93 miles to the south, still over the island of Madagascar. And this time it wasn't just seen by the people of Tenerife. Numerous other French and Malagasy citizens described the same object in striking similar detail. It was a craft that shouldn't exist, but it did. As a technically trained, scientifically minded individual, Edmond Compagnie had no way to explain the sighting using any of the knowledge or terminology he was familiar with. This entire experience was so strange to him that after much thought, the only conclusion he could come up with was it might have been an alien craft of some kind. Reports of the event quickly garnered attention far beyond the shores of Madagascar. French Air Force commanders stationed in Madagascar promptly launched an investigation into the sighting. And while their report was withheld from the public, it eventually caught the attention of future French President Charles de Gaulle. And his interest in the case later contributed to the creation of GEIPAN, GEIPAN, a unit within the French Space Agency dedicated to investigating unidentified aerial phenomena. In 1964, 10 years after that sighting, that case was reopened. Interviews were conducted with multiple witnesses, each one consistently described seeing the same bright green object that night. The investigation concluded the two sightings had occurred 93 miles apart. If it had been a single object, it would have needed to travel at a speed exceeding 1,800 miles per hour to cover the distance and the time reported. Of course, they never arrived at a conclusion about what it was. Well, from Madagascar, we're going to Levelland, Texas. The year's 1957. Friends and fellow farm worker Pedro Saucedo and Joe Salaz were heading home after a rare night off. Pedro and Joe worked together on the same farm. Saturday night, they had spent the evening in Levelland, Texas, enjoying themselves before starting to drive back home. And Levelland is exactly what it sounds like. Level, flat, and as smooth as a tabletop. When they left town, they were driving west on Farm Road 115, a fairly isolated and dark stretch where they were mostly alone on the road. Relaxed in their car, the two joked about their lives and families, and suddenly they saw a bright light in the sky. Something unusual enough that immediately caught their attention. It was too bright to be a planet or a star, and as they got closer, they realized it wasn't just a light, it was an object, cylindrical in shape. Well, Joe literally freaked out, says it's coming right at us, and his friend told him to calm down. Fear gripped him as the object approached, growing larger with every second. And by this time, both were panicking, thinking they needed to get out of there. But just as they were about to react, something strange happened. The engine of their truck stalled. The headlights went off, and they were left in complete darkness except for the blinding light of the object moving toward them. Well, they had no idea what was going on. The object was headed straight for them, and it was enormous. Whatever it was, the object soon hovered directly over their stalled truck. Well, throughout UFO history, hundreds of people have reported their vehicles being affected by unidentified flying objects. And Pedro and Joe's experience aligned closely with these other accounts. Pedro didn't know whether he was being attacked or if it was something personal. All he knew was he needed to get out of there. In a panic, he drove out of the truck trying to find protection. Joe, on the other hand, was frozen in fear, petrified, unable to move. Well, as Pedro tried to stay hidden, the object seemed to focus on him. It hovered right over him, and a powerful beam of light shone directly down on his position. The light grew intensely bright, so blinding it was difficult to look at it. At the same time, a gust of wind or some invisible force emanated from the object. Pedro felt an intense heat and heard a whooshing sound. He sensed air rushing past him as if coming from an exhaust system. It felt like the blast of a jet engine, something hot and powerful enough to generate a strong gust of wind. Overwhelmed with fear, Pedro believed the object was actually going to harm him. Suddenly, that object rocketed up into the sky at an extreme speed, flew faster than anything was supposed to at those altitudes. Pedro estimated its speed to be between 600 and 800 miles per hour. By the time he stood up, the object started moving quickly, continuing to accelerate until it disappeared into the distance. Well, with the craft now out of range, the truck came back to life. Pedro stumbled back to the vehicle, started the engine, and the electrical system began to function properly again. Lights came back on, the motor roared to life, and they were able to drive away to a place where they felt safer. They drove to the nearest phone in the next town and called the sheriff's office in Level. Officer A.J. Fowler was working the night desk and took the call. Well, the officer asked if they were reporting an accident, and they said no, not an accident, as much as it was a bizarre happening. A big light that almost hit them, moving at about 800 miles per hour. Officer Fowler asked for a description of the object. Pedro had no idea what it looked like. Initially, of course, Fowler didn't take Pedro's report seriously. Being a Hispanic part-time farmer in Texas, Pedro wasn't somebody Fowler considered a credible witness, so he thought it was a hoax. But shortly after the call from Pedro and Joe, the sheriff and his deputy realized they should have taken the report more seriously. That same night, nearly a dozen additional reports came into the sheriff's office, all describing similar incidents of vehicles being affected by UFOs. Among the witnesses was Sheriff Weir Clem, who saw a bright red object moving across the sky at 1:30 in the morning. This was November 3rd. This happened during the investigation of the incident. At 1:45 a.m., Levelland's fire chief, Ray Jones, also reported seeing a strange object after his vehicle suddenly stalled. And this wave of sightings came to be known as the UFO storm in 1957. On the night of November 2nd, West Texas police got a total of 15 phone calls from local citizens across at least 13 separate locations. That same night, similar sightings were reported in White Sands, New Mexico, 310 miles away. In all, witnesses throughout the American Southwest reported about 118 sightings during the month of November, with a third of them involving vehicle interference. Today, the Levelland sightings is considered the first of dozens of vehicle interference cases reported in 1957. How the UFOs affect the mechanics is still a mystery. Well, from Levelland, Texas, let's go to Papua New Guinea. The year is 1959. This is what's known as the Gill sightings. It was June 26, 1959, in Bonai, Papua New Guinea. Teacher Stephen Moy made his way to the local Anglican mission school, deep within the shadowy rainforest. It was dark, and the atmosphere was terrifying. Through the gaps in the tree branches, he saw a bright light hovering above him. Too frightened to stop and investigate, he ran as fast as he could toward Father William Gill at the mission house. Now, Father Gill was the Anglican priest in charge of education and other community services. And recently he had been documenting strange sightings that the locals believed to be ships from another world. For Stephen Moy, this was his second such sighting in less than a week. When he got to Father Gill, he was panicked and told him the strange light had returned. Well, Father Gill, of course, was skeptical but open-minded enough to consider a range of possibilities for what might be happening. He thought to himself it might be Venus. He speculated that Moy's sightings, along with others, could have been caused by Venus. As the brightest of the planets, Venus can sometimes appear to shimmer or dance due to atmospheric refraction. Moy, of course, insisted it wasn't Venus, it was closer. Well, determined to get a clearer view, they headed down to the beach, and when they got there, they spotted a bright light to the northwest, something Father Gill immediately found unusual. For one thing, it was very clear to him it was not Venus. In fact, he could see Venus to the left of the mysterious object. First, he thought it might be an airplane, but the object didn't behave like any conventional aircraft. It appeared to be completely solid. As the object descended closer, they could see it casting a halo of light on the underside of the clouds. Exactly what Moy had seen before. Then, without warning, the mysterious object vanished in a fraction of a second. It was gone as if it never existed. Well, Father Gill went back to the mission house to record everything he'd seen. He was certain he had seen something, but he was cautious about his observations, refused to draw any definitive conclusions until he was absolutely sure. Soon he was joined by one of his assistants, Annie Laurie Barroa. He worked as an assistant school teacher at the local mission. Father Gill wrote a letter to the Reverend David Dury, acting principal of St. Aidan's College in Garrigarona and Dogura. He wrote 645. bright white lights out amidst the northwestern sky. Well, they did a full report of their UFO sighting, and suddenly, while he was writing his report, he was interrupted by Moy again. And he said, "Father, do you see that? This time the sighting was much closer, about 500 feet from the mission house. One main object, but several smaller satellite objects are also visible nearby." Moy asked Father Gill what it was, and he said possibly satellites. Well, satellites had only recently been launched into Earth orbit. 2 years earlier, on October 4th, 1957, the Soviet Union sent Sputnik 1 into space. That was the world's first known artificial satellite. At that time, it was the only reference point people had for objects moving through the sky. As the object approached, they saw a figure on the craft, and it became clear to them at that point it was not a satellite. There were actually 4 figures on top of the craft, and these figures appeared to be fairly large. But nobody knew who they were or what they were. If anybody could answer that question, the object moved past them and shot across the bay. It was seen by approximately 38 people in total. The next evening, Father Gill wrote a report to his superiors, still convinced there had to be a logical explanation for what he'd seen that night. At that moment, Annie Laurie's scream interrupted his writing. She came and told him it's back. He asked where, and she said, "At the beach." On the beach, Stephen Moy and others had already gathered. They were watching what appeared to be the same object, including the mysterious shape on top. It wasn't alone this time. Once again, 4 figures were on top of the craft who were clearly visible to everybody below. And once again, it appeared these figures were very large, and people began to wonder about their identity. Father Gill suggested it could be the military. He still insisted it might be some sort of advanced or exotic aircraft from the Americans. One long after World War II, and the U.S. maintained a significant presence in the Pacific region. When determined to initiate communication, Father Gill looked at the craft and waved his hands toward the craft. Unexpectedly, something extraordinary happened. One of the figures moved to the edge and appeared to wave back, seeming as though the figure on the craft was acknowledging the people below, and Father Gill's gesture had prompted a response. Then the craft moved out of view toward the mission house. Following Father Gill, everybody headed back to the mission house to see what was going on. At the compound, 330 feet from the mission house, that craft hovered silently as if waiting for further contact. Father Gill had decided to try an additional experiment. He turned on his flashlight and aimed it toward the craft and waved it back and forth. To everybody's amazement, the object began to move in a slow pendulum-like motion, appearing to imitate the movement of the flashlight. After a few moments, the object gradually drifted into the cloud cover and disappeared in front of the crowd. This is one of over 60 UFO sightings reported within a few weeks in the Papua New Guinea area. Eventually, 38 people, including Father Gill, teachers Stephen Moy and Anais Rarada and Ms. Nessie Moy, gathered to observe the main UFO. In total, 25 witnesses signed Father Gill's report documenting the strange sightings of June 26 and 27, 1959. 6 months after the event, Air Force personnel interviewed Father Gill and attributed what he saw to a celestial phenomena. Specifically, they said it was the planet Venus. They claimed Father Gill's nearsightedness led to his misidentification. Of course, that explanation didn't account for the other 25 witnesses who also signed the report. For Father Gill, reflecting on the events over the decades through the lenses of religious beliefs, the sightings may have felt like an angelic experience. 1959 sighting in Papua New Guinea led to one of the first credible witness reports of extraterrestrials in UFO history. Well, for Papua New Guinea, let's go to Australia. The year is 1963. It's Moy, or Mo, Australia. This is the so-called milking shed sighting. It's February 15th, 1963, in Willow Grove near Moy, Victoria, Australia. Farmer Charles Brew and his son Trevor Brew began a new day of work. Now, Mo was a small town of about 2,000 to 3,000 people in the eastern part of the state of Victoria, about 81 miles east-southeast of Melbourne. Charlie Brew and his family operated a dairy farm, milked about 70-80 head of cattle every day. And Charlie was a well-known, respected figure in the small local community of Willow Grove. And like most mornings, Trevor helped his father with the milking. While they were working, Charlie heard a strange sound coming from the east. It resembled a wailing wind noise, an unsettling and distinct sound. Charlie looked outside, searching for the source of the noise, and didn't see anything unusual. At that moment, though, the animals on the farm began to act erratically. They appeared extremely agitated, moving around anxiously and mooing, something had disturbed them. In many other UFO cases, animals were reported to react similarly, as if sensing something unnatural approaching. The whistling noise grew louder, and then suddenly Charlie spotted something emerging from the low clouds, flying toward the farm. The object approached from the east at a steep angle, moving quite slowly. He dismissed the idea of it being a plane. Grabbed his coat, he stepped out of the milking shed to get a better view, determined to identify whatever it was. Finally, standing in the open space outside the shed, he saw that strange object. It appeared roundish in shape, and his initial thought was it might be a helicopter. After all, his understanding of aviation led him to believe that only a helicopter could fly like that, emerging from the low clouds. However, as the object got closer, it became evident it was something entirely different. It wasn't like anything he was familiar with, and it was unlike anything he'd ever seen before. As Charlie looked on in awe, the object moved toward him. As it got closer, it appeared larger and larger, and finally it was directly in front of him. And he saw it wasn't any ordinary object. It seemed bizarre and strange. The base of the object appeared to be rotating in an anti-clockwise direction and had the classic flying saucer shape like two bowls joined together. Additionally, it was a slender, antenna-like structure protruding from the top of the object. Almost at that very instant, Charlie experienced a sharp, intense pain centered right between his eyes. As he later explained, he wasn't somebody who normally suffered headaches, but this was a headache unlike any he'd ever felt before. Overwhelmed by pain, he bent down and collapsed to the ground. He was frightened and uncertain about what was going to happen. At that moment, the craft emitted a powerful blast of air, resembling an exhaust or something of that nature. Trevor remained inside the milking shed while Charlie went out to investigate when his father didn't come back. Trevor grew increasingly worried. He could hear the whooshing sound, and when he glanced out the window, he saw his father on the ground, clutching his head in pain. Well, he yelled to his father he was coming, and he rushed out to help. Suddenly, the object seemed to become aware of Trevor's approach, and it backed up and ascended into the low cloud cover. In a matter of seconds, it vanished. Well, despite the commotion, Trevor never saw the object himself. His primary concern was his father, and he barely glanced up at the sky. But he couldn't ignore the eerie sound he heard. Had no doubt that his father had witnessed something extraordinary. Knowing his father's honest and grounded nature, he was certain Charlie would never fabricate a story, especially one involving a flying saucer. So Trevor believed his father without question, and the headache Charlie had experienced had been quite severe. It stayed with him to the end of that day and persisted throughout the night. He remained very conscious of how brief the experience had been, how condensed it had felt, and yet for him it was a profoundly intense and vivid encounter. The Australian Air Force and National Science Agency sent investigating teams to the farm, and Charlie Brew gave them a detailed report. They even asked him to draw a sketch. Air Force eventually concluded that what Charlie Brew had witnessed was a natural phenomenon, most likely a tornado. However, UFO investigators questioned this hypothesis, considering the absence of tornado damage at the farm. For the rest of his life, he maintained he had seen a UFO. And on that note, we come to the end of today's show. We'll be back tomorrow, and once again, you'll be listening to Ken Hudnall, the Ken Hudnall Show. Until then, have a truly great evening.